In the mid-20th century, one man in Detroit, Michigan would secure an $800 loan that changed American music forever. His vision would build stars, break barriers, and make millions of dollars. Though its influence would be everlasting, its winning formula would not be. Why was that? Let's explore together. Hi everyone, and welcome to Music Theories, where I explain and analyze all topics related to music. So if you're into music, music theory, music history, or even history in general, be sure to hit the subscribe button and join our community of music geeks. This video is part of a series I'm making on the industrialization of music, so be sure to check out the previous segments on my channel. We cannot begin talking about this topic without first addressing the issue that Black Americans faced in America. I would like to do a whole separate series really getting into the nitty-gritty of racism within music because the topic really warrants being addressed in its own light. But for the sake of this video, it's important to first establish what was going on in America at the time. The time period we will be discussing, the 1950s and 60s, is still very much the era of Jim Crow laws. In other words, the legalized racial segregation specifically intended to marginalize Black Americans following the Civil War and the end of slavery. On top of separating basic necessities like bathrooms and water fountains to white and colored, these laws denied African Americans the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to hold certain jobs, access to better education, and so on. To better understand this terrible time in America, I request that you watch or read more about the era of Jim Crow. I have linked a video in the eye and in the description that I think is well done. I think the success of certain Black artists leads people to believe that segregation didn't have a significant effect on music. Many will also say that music was responsible for bridging the gap between races, which is not false, but definitely an oversimplification. I, again, will be doing a video dedicated to discussing segregation within music, but for this video, it's at least important to recognize that since the beginning of American music, Black artists were ridiculed, ostracized, exploited, and stolen from. Many venues would allow Black musicians, but not Black patrons. Labels would refuse to work with Black musicians only to have white artists sing their songs. Touring Black musicians were turned away from hotels and restaurants only to sleep in their cars and eat rotting leftovers. Hopefully you get the picture. More on this to come. As the years marched on and Americans fought for their civil rights, schools were integrated under law and African Americans were working to integrate other parts of society as well. Gordy Jr. was born in Detroit, Michigan. He's actually Gordy III, his grandfather being the son of a white plantation owner and a woman that he enslaved. His father, Gordy Sr., moved up to Detroit from the South with many other Black Americans looking to escape the terrifying threat of the KKK. Michigan at this time had a booming automotive industry that promised jobs to all the migrant Americans looking for work. Gordy Sr. was an entrepreneur, owning a grocery store, a print shop, and a plastering and carpentry business. By the time Gordy Jr. was born in 1929, as the seventh of 8 children, the Gordy family had worked their way up to become a solid middle-class family. Gordy Jr., unlike his older siblings, had no interest in working in the family business. He also wasn't great at school, distracted by the idea of singing, dancing, and writing songs. His dreams were crushed when he was kicked out of music class in high school. He dropped out of high school altogether and decided to take up his next big passion as a career: boxing. He didn't do all that bad, and by the time he was 20, he won 13 out of 19 of his professional fights. Concerned with the health risks involved with boxing, Gordy decided to turn back to music until he was drafted into the Army in 1951. He spent 2 years in the military, which worked out well for him and allowed him to earn his GED. Upon returning from the Korean War with his certificate in 1953, he got married to Thelma Louise Coleman and opened a record store that sold records And you guessed it, 3D glasses. Meanwhile, he continued to work on his songwriting craft. Unfortunately, the store didn't hold out since the times were changing and folks were looking to buy R&B records. Gordy mostly sold jazz, which was going out of fashion. The store closed and he had no choice but to join up at one of the plants in Detroit, Lincoln Mercury. Meanwhile, he still continued to work on his songwriting craft, composing in his head while he worked monotonous labor day in and day out. By the time he was 27, Gordy Jr. couldn't take it anymore, and he left his job at the plant to finally pursue music. This caused friction with his wife and eventually separation. But his experience with Lincoln Mercury would come in handy later, as we will discuss. Through a stroke of luck as well as family connections, he was able to meet up with singer Jackie Wilson while he was playing a club in town. The two managed to co-write a song called Reet Petite, which went on to be a hit for Wilson, along with 6 other Gordy originals, including Lonely Teardrops and To Be Loved. While this is exactly what Gordy wanted to be doing with his life, his royalties earned were next to nothing. He figured the only way to earn money while doing the thing he loved was to own his own company and produce his own records. He continued to co-write with anyone he could, and in 1959 he wrote a song called Come to Me with Marv Johnson. While the song was leased to United Artists for national distribution, Gordy believed it had what was called crossover potential. Remember what I said in the beginning about segregation in music? Here's an example of that. Most black musicians were not featured on the pop charts. They were featured on what was called the race charts, later named the R&B charts. This extended to distribution as well, and many stores refused to sell race records. Those that did could only be found within black neighborhoods. However, every once in a while, an R&B song became so popular that it would transcend or cross over to the pop charts. This is what they called a crossover hit. So, like I said, Gordy believed Come to Me had the potential to cross over, but what he didn't have was the funding to make that happen. He requested a loan of $800 from his family's savings account, which they gave to him after some deliberation. With this money in 1959, he started Tamala Records, one of the only black-owned labels alongside Peacock Records and VJ Records. His sisters also started a company, Anna Records, and both of their companies would distribute nationally through a deal they made with Chess Records. Long story short, there were eventually multiple labels, as well as Gordy's publishing company, Gibet, combined to create Motown Inc., which, of course, came to be widely known as Motown, named after Detroit's nickname, Motortown. Gordy and family established all of these separate labels to avoid heat from the FCC, who would consistently survey a DJ's playlist for multiplicity, indications of payola, an illegal practice of bribing DJs for airtime. There's no proof that Motown engaged in payola, however, this many-label method is incredibly suspicious. But anyway, for the sake of this video, I'm not going to specify which artists were under which label. We'll just refer to it as Motown. Between 1957 and 1959, he was relying heavily on recording studios in the area, which of course was burdensome financially. Gordy was determined to maintain his own recording facilities to save on costs, but also had a very specific vision inspired by his time working in auto factories that separated his venture from the others. He described this vision to Telegraph in 2016.
I wanted to have a kid off the street walk in one door unknown and come out another door a star, like an assembly line. That was my dream. My family said, "That's stupid. Those are cars. You can't do that with human beings." I said, "Well, it's the same thing. The artists come in and you have one group writing the songs and producing them, then somebody else works on their stage performance and so on."
This vision of his seemed incredibly ambitious, but he had everything laid out in a way that was sort of industrialized, quick, and cost-efficient. He purchased and developed Motown within a few residences along West Grand Boulevard in 1959, And soon after, they scored their first hit, Money, by Barrett Strong, and again with Shop Around by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. It was in these homes that Motown's first sound rooms were built, or rather, converted. The basements were used for storage, and the choreography studio was set up in Gordy's vacant apartment while he lived in one of the house's bedrooms. Unfortunately, that choreography studio was soon vandalized and deemed unusable. While they were initially worried about the room sounds in the makeshift studios, it ultimately worked out in their favor since it made Motown records incredibly hard to replicate. This ended up being a strength for Motown because, as many know, white artists would often do covers of black artists' songs, and those would sell better than the original. This was a huge setback for many blues, jazz, and rock artists. However, the quality of Motown records was so high and the sound was so distinct that people were unable to replicate and therefore unable to steal their sound. Many of the employees and artists lived in these houses as well, since they often didn't receive a ton of pay for their work. Gordy did, however, hire a cook and ensured that all of his Motown crew were housed and fed. The rest of the Gordy family was not only supportive, they were involved. His father actually worked as the maintenance man, unpaid. His sisters Esther and Lucy were paid to work the administration piece of the label, so Barry could focus all of his time and effort on the talent portion. These two were invaluable to the success of Motown, handling accounting as well as arranging tours and promoting them. Later, sisters Anna and Gwen were also added to the team. Motown's success certainly wouldn't exist without the help of the Gordy sisters, as the company would have gone under financially. He believed in this vision so confidently that he would soon adorn one of these houses with the name of the Motown headquarters, Hitsville, USA. Gordy truly manifested success. His prerogative was not to make the top 100. It wasn't even to make the top 10 on the R&B chart. It was to make the top 10 on the pop chart every single time. We're talking crossover hit after crossover hit. His reason for this was not simply because he craved success, though that certainly was part of it. The biggest reason is because he simply could not afford to create records that didn't make the top 10 in the early days of Motown. Unlike other labels, they spent almost the entirety of their budget on the recording aspect of their product and spent minimal on distribution, advertising, and promotion. Additionally, they refused to sign artists who wanted a minimum number of records each year to save on costs. His main rule was quality over quantity, and they believed in the idea of keeping it simple. With everything in place to get Motown up and running, Gordy had set a standard for his quality control. He was set to roam the studio listening to his employees' work. He would either shout "fantastic" or "garbage," and there was no in between. He, a songwriter himself, also felt that he had figured out the formula to a hit song. He developed a list of criteria for each submission, as well as a grading system for lyrics, title, performance, background, and arrangement. Each song was to be in present tense and should be a novel condensed. Every song went through him, and if it didn't meet this criteria, he would reject it. He supposedly rejected the first 100 songs that Smokey Robinson pitched to him. He was also known to send producers back over and over to remaster, which explains why he allotted most of his budget to the recording process. As Motown continued to grow, it seems his formula was working. He eventually assembled a team to help him with quality control. He was very open to feedback and would often ask the committee, and even random interns and such, "Would you buy this record for $1 or would you buy a sandwich?" Except whenever someone started to get really technical with the song, say speaking like a sound engineer, he would immediately move on to the next person. He wanted a listener's perspective. That's it. The other secret to Motown's success was their mastering process. Most labels at the time were mastering for phonograph. Gordy Jr. was sure that the radio would be the future of music, so he had his engineers master for the cheapest, smallest phonographs they could find to approximate what would sound good on a compact car radio. The result sounded fantastic on the car radio compared to other songs on the charts, which Gordy states as his second reason for choosing Motown as the brand name. Gordy found a lot of untouched talent in and around Detroit, since many of the major labels hadn't really bothered to venture to the city, especially the rougher parts of the city. And so the next secret of Motown's success could be considered a more ominous one, depending on how you look at it. Many of these talented people were young, still in high school. Many of them had never performed and had no idea what to do up on a stage. And although it's clear that many Motown hits do have a gospel influence, Gordy was insistent on watering down any root sounds coming through the music as much as possible, whereas other labels such as Stax or Atlantic were pushing soul acts like Aretha Franklin in their authenticity. Motown, like any industrialized factory, wanted to maximize profits. What this meant to Berry Gordy was that his artists and his songs should not only appeal to white people, but mostly to affluent white people. He added details to attempt to make Motown fit in with the other pop on the charts: strings, secular lyrics, electronic gimmicks, etc. Gordy wanted soul that was marketable and sophisticated, whatever that means. This was so important to him that he set up an artist cultivation program within the Motown headquarters. Here, he taught these young performers his idea of grooming, etiquette, diction, elocution, table manners, and personal hygiene. He split the 3 floors of this school into choreography, musical arranging, and wardrobe design. This schooling, partially led by Motown executive Maurice King, was incredibly strict. Classes were held Monday through Friday, and anything less than perfect was never accepted. But a place in this school was sought after, because like Gordy described in his initial vision, people would walk in one door off the street and out another door as a star. Some acts, like the Spinners in their early days, would wait outside just in case someone didn't show up for class and they could jump in their place. While Gordy's main motivation was profit, it was also important to him that Motown break certain barriers for the Black community. He wanted Motown artists to be so popular that they'd be allowed to perform in venues that typically only allowed white performers, such as the Copacabana. He did achieve this, though Motown artists all toured together as the Motown Revue, because the only way he could convince these venues to let Black artists play was to provide an incredible lineup of Motown hits. Clearly, one of the factors that played into Gordy's idea of quality was uniformity. All of his acts behaved in a groomed, sophisticated manner. They all wore specific outfits to try to blend in with a wealthy white crowd. In addition to creating a star-making machine, he hired a house band, the Funk Brothers, to maintain the uniformity of sound, led by Earl Van Dyke, and had the same teams of writers and producers using his carefully crafted formula. If you saw my video on the Brill Building, they used a similar assembly line style of production. However, one might argue that Motown did it better in some ways. There are so many Motown hits that Rolling Stone magazine had to compile a list of 100 best Motown songs. Now, Motown is still around today, but I want to make it clear that the period I'm focusing on in this video is known as the Detroit era, beginning with the first Billboard hit Shop Around in 1959, all the way up until the year 1971. Following the success of The Miracles, 1960 gave us Please Mr. Postman by the Marvelettes. These hits gave Motown the footing it needed to truly make huge waves in the industry by the mid-60s, selling more 45s than any other record company in America. They had over 110 top 10 hits from 1961 to 1971. One week in 1966, the top 5 songs in America were all Motown songs. In these 10 years, the Motown success rate was 67%, meaning 2 out of 3 of their songs released were in the top 10. I told you Gordy manifested it. In addition to Smokey Robinson and the Miracles and the Marvelettes, these incredible 10 years brought us Diana Ross and the Supremes, the Four Tops, the Jackson 5, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, the Temptations, Martha and the Vandellas, the Contours, Mary Wells, and so many more. Of course, I'm not going to name 110 plus songs, but I'll give you a top 10 so you can get the picture. Heard It Through the Grapevine, Dancing in the Street, Tracks of My Tears, ABC, Can't Hurry Love, My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, Signed Sealed Delivered, My Guy, Ain't No Mountain High Enough. There are countless changes, developments, and details within the evolution of Motown, but I won't get into all of that here. Overall, Motown did continue to grow, and it did bring some very successful artists of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But its grip on the industry wore off some years after the Detroit era. The original model was incredibly successful, but also relatively short-lived. In the 1970s, fans of rock were criticizing the factory style of Motown. Similar to what we saw with the Brill Building, young music fans came to find mass-produced music to be sort of inauthentic. Still, Motown saw some success in the 70s. Marvin Gaye was the first to break out within Motown, growing a beard and ditching the proper attire. According to Gaye, he proposed the song What's Going On to Gordy while in LA in 1970, and Gordy told him it was the worst thing he'd ever heard in his life. Gaye then angrily protested working with Motown unless they allowed him to record his own music, which they eventually did. This resulted in his famous album also titled What's Going On. Stevie Wonder broke this mold even further in 1972 when he bargained with Motown for the creative freedom he felt he deserved after 10 years with the label. It wasn't easy, and he had to promise Motown that his records would be more successful than the ones Motown had made for him prior. He went on to release Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfillingness's First Finale, Songs in the Key of Life, and Hotter Than July in the next decade, known as Stevie's Perfect Run. Needless to say, Stevie proved Motown wrong. By the mid-80s, the label was deep in financial trouble, and Gordy sold it to MCA Records and Boston Ventures in 1988. He sold Gibet to EMI Publishing in parts between 1997 and 2004. However, their decline was a steady one, and many had negative things to say about the Motown way. Those working the creative parts of the label found it to be soulless after a few years, of feeling simply like a cog in their machine. Like many industries, artists and team members often felt replaceable, interchangeable, and alienation. Mostly because of the uniformity, but also because the executives at the company had become arrogant over the years and literally told them so. They're on record claiming that their artists weren't all that good looking or all that talented, and that they wouldn't be anything without the work of Motown. Unfortunately, many found this statement to have merit, since many of the artists who left Motown weren't able to find success. They've also been known to refer to original Motown recordings as commercials for the rights to the song, since many millions of dollars of their income came from the publishing rights alone through covers and whatnot. But still, the employees of Motown towards the end of the 60s began to complain about their strict rules. They had to punch in and punch out every day. The artist development was often called artist tyranny, since they weren't allowed to make any decisions about their career or their physical appearance. As we know, they weren't allowed to write their own songs. Victims of this included the Jackson 5, the Isley Brothers, Gladys Knight, and of course Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder. The creative process, as collaborative as it was, lacked community. Most of the time, songs were done track by track, and the creators didn't see each other. Musician Jack Brokenshaw worked on every single Diana Ross record, but has never met Diana Ross. Even their live performances felt machine-like, and it got exhausting for those involved. Even the stage banter was predetermined. One time, There was an audible gasp from the audience because Diana Ross stopped performing to take a sip of water. And while Gordy initially took very little pay and invested most of the profits from Motown back into the company, by the late 1960s, he himself was pocketing most of the profits. So one could say that the profit-driven formula of Motown was genius. Others may say it was responsible for their downfall. What do you think? Either way, it's undeniable that Motown's influence on the industry played a huge role in the integration of music. Bill Minutaglio, a journalism professor at the University of Texas, describes how this was important in an article from BET linked below. It gave many working-class Americans the opportunity to be artists. It inspired many of the successful artists of the century and groups to follow. It helped decrease the vilification of black music that was rampant in many parts of America. But like I said, that will be a whole other video. I personally am a big fan of the Motown catalog and believe that the formula brought us some of the greats. But that's just me. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to have a respectful discussion surrounding the methods of Motown and how it compares to the pop machine today. Lastly, if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend reading The Story of Motown by Peter Benjaminson and Greil Marcus. There are so many fascinating stories and details that I wasn't able to include here, and it's totally worth the read. I know this one was kind of a doozy, but thank you so much for sticking through it and watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing. Your support really means the world. See you next time.